every American citizen must have an equal right to vote.
The administration of elections is primarily a state and local responsibility.
Whether you voted for the very first time or waited in line for a very long time, by the way, we have to fix that.
Welcome to High Turnout, Wide Margins. This is Brianna Lennon. I am the Boone County Clerk in Missouri, and with me is my co-host,
Eric Fay, Director of Elections in St. Louis County, Missouri.
And we are very excited today to be talking to Paul DeGregorio. He's going to be talking to us about the EAC and HAVA. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Brianna, and thank you, Eric. It's indeed an honor because both of you are just wonderful election officials and wonderful people. So it's an honor to be on this show.
Oh, thank you. So first, we always ask with our introductory question, which I know for you is very involved because you've spent a lifetime in elections, but how did you get your start and what was your career path in the election space?
Well, it started in 1970 when I volunteered for a campaign. Kit Bond was running for state auditor back then, and I decided I lived on the Hill, decided to hand out literature. Many people around the country know that because they have been involved in politics. And it got me interested in elections and the election process. And 1972, I was Kit Bond's youth coordinator and in St. Louis. And I handed out literature on the Hill, and actually Kit Bond did relatively well on the Hill. And my dad was the mailman for the Hill, and he said, you did pretty well, and the Democrats are not happy. And I said, well, how do I get the results? He said, go see Uncle Lito DiMartino at the St. Louis City Board of Elections. So I went downtown and I saw Uncle Lito, who was the assistant director of elections, and he got out the old books and he showed me the results, which were handwritten because it was the old lever machines and results were handwritten down in a book. And he gave me the little tour of the election office to kind of explain how things worked. And that was the spark that, gave me the interest in this whole field of election administration. And things evolved from there. I ran John Ashcroft's campaign for Attorney General in Missouri in 1976 when I was 24. And then I was on John Ashcroft's kitchen cabinet, and I was the go-to guy for when the deadline was for voter registration, absentee voting, campaign finance disclosures. I was the person they turned to with that information, and I made it my business to understand it. And then I went from there. When John Ashcroft became governor in 1984, I expressed an interest in the St. Louis County Board of Elections, and the governor appoints the election board there. And I had been Ashcroft's assistant. I had worked as a special assistant in the Reagan administration. I wanted to be an administrator. And so the St. Louis County Board of Election Commissioners hired me as the Republican director in May of 1985. My goal from the first day was to be the best election official in the state and in the country. And I took an office that was pretty much patronage ridden and backwards. We had the old big 17-pound poll books, and within a year and a half of me getting there, we had made them into electronic digitized poll books, still paper, but a great improvement. So that's how I got my start, and I learned from others.
I know you're also at least somewhat responsible for getting Matt Masterson into elections. Maybe you'd like to share a little bit of that with the audience.
During the course of my term there, each EAC commissioner had a special assistant. And so I had one. I got to have my own special assistant. But I had a good friend from Cincinnati, an election official there, who asked me if I had any internships. And so it was the year I became chairman, 2006. So I went to the executive director and said, do I get an intern or can I have an intern? He says, oh, yes, Mr. Chairman, you can have an intern. So this friend of mine, he gave me the name of a guy named Matt Masterson, who had just graduated from law school. And I interviewed Matt. I interviewed other people too, but I interviewed Matt, and he was quite impressive, and he was interested in elections and interested in Washington, D.C. And so I decided to bring him in as my intern. And I was really impressed by him. I mean, he was hardworking and he wanted to learn from me about elections. And so I had him do research. I had him meet with election officials, come to meetings with me, and hear my discussions with election officials. He was just hungry for all that. And his research and his knowledge and his writing was impeccable. Well, it just so happens 3 months later, my special assistant quit to move back to Michigan. And so I offered Matt the job as my special assistant because he was so good. You know, I just really let him flourish in that job and serve me because he was so good at what he did. And he really helped me as a commissioner, write speeches, do research, present information to me before I made decisions. And he was really into elections. And I mentored him. I mean, I really mentored him in this whole business of elections and how it worked in a bipartisan spirit. You know, and he saw the pressures I was under by particularly became under Republicans to vote a certain way or to bring up issues that were not, in my view, not relevant to the Help America Vote Act. He saw that, you know, and he saw, you know, but I had to go through, and he also witnessed the fact that I wasn't reappointed in 2007 by the White House, you know, and I had a phone call from Roy Blunt to inform me of that. And Roy was very sorry. I mean, he was extremely sorry. He said, you know, that I had the full support of him and Kit Bond and others, but that there were certain people who did not want me reappointed because they said I wasn't Republican enough and I was just too bipartisan. It was a sad thing, but it happened. And so when I was leaving the EAC, Tom Wilkie was the executive director. And I said, Tom, there's only one thing I ask of you is to take care of Matt Masterson and keep him on. I said, because the guy's good. And he said to me, he said, Paul, you don't have to worry about that. He said, I have an idea where we're going to place Matt because he is so good. And he was so helpful, not just to me, but the whole staff of the EAC. So I was very thrilled. Years later, when Matt called me to tell me that he was being considered for the EAC, and should he do it? And I said, you know, please, by far. I mean, you are so good; you'd be great at it. And nothing made me happier than to call Senator Roy Blunt when his appointment was languishing in the Senate, and asking Roy, "This is really a really good person, and I'm asking you this favor to get this guy confirmed." And it was in the last days of the Republicans controlling the Senate back then. And Roy came through and he got Matt confirmed to the EAC. And Matt got to serve on the EAC for about almost similar length that I did. And he made such an amazing difference, you know, and such a good person, but really an amazing election official and public servant. But sadly, he was not reappointed for the same reasons I was not reappointed. And he, you know, so he had seen my experience, and he, you know, he was aware of the politics, sort of more or less, of things like this. But it was one of my proudest moments, you know, in my life to help somebody like that. And but you know, from those who know me out there, many do. One of the things that I try to do is to mentor people, young people, particularly involved in elections, whether it's here in the United States or abroad, to help them in their careers, because I think that, you know, we need really good people. You know, the situation today compared to what it was in 1985 when I became director of elections in St. Louis County, or in 2003 when I was on the EAC, is so much different. Is that the level of professionalism of election officials is so much higher, and the awareness of election administration is so much higher. But at the same time, I think all of us know that the trust in elections is at a low that hasn't been seen since probably 2000, and it's really sad for this country. During my years as election director, 1985 to 1993, it coincided with Roy Blunt being the Missouri Secretary of State. And I had met Roy in 1973 when he was appointed county clerk of Greene County, and I was at my first ever Republican Lincoln Day in Kansas City, and I met Roy there just briefly. But I met him subsequent to that, and before he was Secretary of State. He had run for lieutenant governor actually in 1980. And so I developed a good, strong friendship with Roy, and Roy asked me to help train county clerks and new election officials as they came along. So I got to know Roy very well. He, of course, then went to Congress after that and got into leadership. And then, in 1990, when I was election director, we had the closest congressional race in the country. 52 votes separated the winner from loser. It was in the 2nd congressional district, and Joan Kelly Horn, a Democrat, had defeated Jack Buechner, a Republican, the Republican incumbent, by 52. And we had punch cards. And so we went through 6 weeks of scrutiny by the House Administration Committee and the Democratic National Committee, the Republican committees on both sides, and many lawyers. We did the recount, and instead of losing by 52, he lost by 54. But the votes only changed by 2. And it was because of what I learned from others around the country and using punch cards, that you sharpen the stylus, you take the hanging chat out, the chat out of the back to make sure you have clean punches. So that was in 1990, 10 years before 2000. Then we had Bush versus Gore, and the country and the world knew about punch card voting and pregnant chat and hanging chat and all those kinds of things. And there was a real push for election reform, and various committees were formed by election officials and others, bipartisan committees, for election reform throughout the country. And if you, in the context of 2001, George W. Bush was president. Republicans controlled the Senate up until May 24th, when then Senator Jim Jeffries became a Democrat. And so the Democrats barely controlled the Senate, and the Republicans controlled the House, but not by much. And so there was a real push to get something done in a bipartisan spirit for election reform in the country. And Roy Blunt, who was well respected in the House and moving up in leadership, was asked if he might be interested in chairing a committee, a bipartisan committee actually, on election reform in the House, a representative. And he approached me if I was interested in being the executive director of that committee. I said, yeah, I'd be interested. It was just supposed to be a 6-week committee to come up with legislation that they can pass in the House, bipartisan legislation. So I agreed to it. But then it was just a few weeks later when Congressman Bob Ney, who was chairman of the House Administration Committee, decided no, he wanted the election legislation to come from his committee. And so this bipartisan committee didn't come about, but Congressman Ney chaired the House Administration Committee that oversaw what the House was going to do on election reform. But Roy Blunt had a big role in that. And because of that, Roy Blunt turned to me as various iterations of what became the Help America Vote Act was considered by the House of Representatives. And so I saw these first copies. I saw what the first, was. And Roy was very interested, at least for me, on what he thought would be a good bipartisan bill. That not looking at it, he didn't want me to look at it through Republican eyes. He wanted me to look at it in a bipartisan way and think about that and where compromise could come. And so the result was the House did pass something in a bipartisan way. Blunt worked very closely with Congressman Steny Hoyer, who's still in leadership, certainly in the House of Representatives, to craft this bipartisan bill that eventually passed the House of Representatives, that created a body to kind of oversee election reform in the United States, eventually called the EAC. And then the Senate passed its own version, again in a bipartisan manner. And our own then Senator Kit Bond was involved in that bipartisan push in the Senate. And so there were 2 bills, a House and Senate bill. One version, the House version, had them as part-time commissioners, but the Senate version had them as full-time commissioners. And eventually the Senate version prevailed on the development of what the EAC was, and I knew the Democrats wanted to set up voting system standards that were mandatory, the Republicans voluntary, and they became voluntary voting system standards. So the bottom line is they passed this bill, they created this 4-member agency of 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, recommended by the House and Senate, and by the leadership of the House and Senate, appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. And so it was a a lengthy process to go through. But the reason I got picked really is because, again, owing it to Roy Blunt. Roy Blunt was at the White House at a meeting where they were discussing who to appoint to the first commission, and they had narrowed it down to 8 people. And Roy was there, and he said, you don't have anybody on this list who's ever run elections. They were all kind of political type people. They said, well, who do you have, Roy? And so, well, I got this guy, Paul DeGregorio from Missouri. He's well respected. He was the director of elections in St. Louis County. And there was somebody in the meeting at the White House that said, I know who he is. He's well respected. I used to order voter registration tapes from Paul in St. Louis County. And so the bottom line is that I had an interview at the White House. And then during that interview, the guy said to me, I see you worked for General Ashcroft. Now, John Ashcroft was the Attorney General of the United States at the time. I said, yes, I did. And I said, does he know you're going for this? I said, no, I was told not to say anything to anyone, that this was supposed to be quiet. So I have not. He says, well, I work with General Ashcroft. I'll see him tomorrow. And I said, well, ask General Ashcroft, of all the people he knows, who runs elections the best. And so the guy actually did the next day. And then Ashcroft called over to the White House, says, this is the best guy you can have in America for this job. So the White House called me the next day and said, and offered me, the job. So that's kind of how that came about. And then I had this Senator Bond sitting next to me in front of the Senate, introducing me to the Senate Rules Committee, chaired by Senator Lott. And Bond took me around. And the same man I was his youth coordinator for in 1972, in 2003, he's sitting next to me, putting me forth before the Senate committee. I got confirmed unanimously along with my 3 colleagues. I got to go first that day because of really Senator Bond. So I was appointed to this body, and my goal was to do the best I can in the country to serve the people of the nation, and not in a partisan manner. And so I worked with Buster Soares, who was a Secretary of State of New Jersey at one time, but Secretary of State of New Jersey didn't have anything to do with elections, but he was well respected, with Gracia Hillman, who became vice chair, who was also on the commission, former head of the League of Women Voters, and Ray Martinez, who had worked in the Clinton White House in governmental affairs. And that was the first commission. And I met Gracia before we were confirmed at a coffee shop in Washington at a Starbucks. And we hit it off immediately. And our first job was to find real estate, a place for the EAC to land and meet with GSA and all those things to get things going on the EAC, even before we got confirmed by the Senate in December 2003. But my goal was to work in a bipartisan spirit. And I sat down with Ray Martinez, Democrat, and we chatted for hours initially to say, okay, here's HAVA, and here's what we're supposed to do. Let's make a list of what we need to do according to what the law says we should do. And we did. And it's amazing how we got through that checklist over the next year or so to get everything done, to get the certification, to get the voting system standards in place. They just passed the newer 2.0 version. But I remember that one, and we had 6,700 public comments. And it was, again, Ray Martinez and they went over every single one and talked about every single one and the merits of every one of these comments to consider them before we put the first voting system standards in place. And then the voting labs had to be certified, and then voting equipment, all of these things that we had to really get done in those first years, because we wanted people to take the EAC seriously. We wanted to be taken seriously, and we worked in a bipartisan manner. We had disagreements, and we had pull from Democrats, had pull from the Democratic side. I had pull from the Republican side to vote certain ways and do certain things, but we really resisted that. The job was to serve the American people, and I was the one representative of the 4 who kind of represented local election officials around the country. And the Brianna, Wendy Nord, who served in your position for so many years, was a Democrat. I was a Republican, but I relied on Wendy. I used to call her all the time saying, Wendy, we're thinking about doing this. What do you think? And she gave me all kinds of input, as you can imagine, because you knew Wendy. She was very opinionated. but she gave me some great advice, as we were going through the voting system standards and what we should include and what we shouldn't. And it was very helpful to me. So I reached out to Democrats and Republicans around the country, election officials, because I knew that election officials in this country work in such a bipartisan manner. And so we did that, and we worked very hard. Part of it was this, this clearinghouse, they called it back in the FEC days, but it was set best standards, best practices. And so we put together best practices for election officials. There was a lot that we did. And again, it was in a bipartisan manner. So when I was on the commission, nearly 4 years, there was 183 votes cast. And of the 183, 182 were unanimous. And that was a lot of work to get done. It's not that we just disagree, but we found ways to bring consensus forward and to get things done.
So Paul, it was interesting for me to hear about a formulation of HAVA and then your early days on the EAC, that there was a lot of bipartisanship, at least it seems like, that HAVA was really a compromise, and a lot of things you did on the EAC were a compromise, and juxtapose that with HR1 and S1 now that don't seem, at least in their current form, to be that way. And it seems like just generally in our political culture, that doesn't seem to be the case. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, as to why now a huge bill that has a very large impact on election administration, there doesn't seem to be input from local election administrators. There doesn't seem to be any desire to compromise, at least at this point.
Well, Eric, whether it's federal legislation or whether it's state legislation, and both seem to be, legislation that's being considered and passed on a partisan basis without bipartisan input or really much input from election officials. It's sad and it's wrong. And it's wrong for this country. If we're ever going to rebuild trust in elections after, they've been disparaged, they were disparaged in 2020 during the election and afterwards, we have to work in a bipartisan spirit. And again, I know at our core in this country, election officials work in a bipartisan spirit. And it just doesn't make sense why elected officials who are involved in public policy making that affects elections can't do the same and work in a bipartisan spirit. And there's overreach. I mean, there's overreach on one side and there's overreach on the other side in this legislation. And, there was similar, that back in 2001, there was some legislation that would have been considered, overreach on both sides that was submitted to the Congress, but HAVA was the result of compromise. And, I hope that we might be able to get, some compromise, and there should be, whenever election legislation is passed, really, it should be on a bipartisan manner to instill trust, because if it's done in a partisan way, whether it's in Georgia or whether it's in the U.S. House of Representatives, you're going to breed distrust in the election process and anger and frustration. And we really don't need that in the country right now. We need a heck of a lot less than that, in fact, more than ever. And it's sad to me that someone like, Senator Roy Blunt is opting to retire, because I know Roy, and I know Roy, he still has a great relationship with Congressman Steny Hoyer in the House. And I know how Roy, tries to do things in a bipartisan manner when it comes to anything, and particularly, especially when it comes to elections. So I don't know, if there can be some compromise. I hope that there can be, and I hope that election officials around the country, as they did in 2001 and before HAVA was passed in 2002, they came together. They let their voices be known to their elected officials on what they believe needed to be in election legislation or what should be considered. And I hope that they continue to do that, because, it's the election officials that, run the elections in their districts. The difference today, as opposed to back then, is that when congressmen were getting election results, they usually called their county clerk's office to get the results, because it wasn't on, it wasn't on the internet, and That's how they got the results from each county in the district. So they had a good relationship with each county clerk and their district or election officials. Today, they just go on the internet and they get it, really quickly, and they don't have that kind of relationship. But I hope that election officials around the country will speak to their congressmen and their senators about, what would be good for the country, and what would be good would be a bipartisan type of compromise that really helps both sides. They're not going to get everything they want, but like HAVA, it was something that made it harder to cheat, but easier to vote. I think we can use some of that again by making it easier to vote. People certainly in 2020 and the ways that they voted around the country because of COVID expressed the way that they like to vote. And so we should continue to make it easier to vote. But I think, because of some people's concern about fraud, whether it's real or not, but because of their concerns, we need to have make sure there's safeguards in there too.
I'm curious, kind of two things. One is, do you feel like when you left, was there a lot of unfinished business that you really wanted to do and just couldn't do? And two, not to be too pointed about it, but do you think it's moving in the right direction? Would you think that the EAC of now is what you expected it to be when you were on it?
We did a lot in my nearly 4 years there. Again, what was required on a HAVA. Best practices was something that, I thought was kind of an unfinished business when I left, but they did a good job. And, but the problem what happened after I left is that I was replaced with a much more partisan person. And as the Democrats left, they were replaced with more partisan people too. And so there was a time when there was really nothing getting done at the EAC, and there were 2-2 votes. And then, of course, there was a time when there wasn't even 3 commissioners to get anything done. And so it languished. You have to remember there was this, during that time too, a lot of people wanted the EAC eliminated because they felt that it was too much federal overreach. But then it kind of came back, particularly when Matt Masterson got on the commission. And they did get some things done, and they did move forward. But there's still now, partisanship on the commission. And I don't know if they work cohesively as they did. It took them a while to reach a compromise and to get things done, to get this latest version of the voting system guidelines, the 2.0, passed. It was finally done. And that was unfinished business for years at the EAC. I don't know. I know all 4 people. I wish they'd work in a more bipartisan manner sometimes than they do, because I think they'd be more effective if they did. But I know that some of them are pulled in partisan directions. And I think if they didn't do that, if they listened to election officials, they'd have more respect and be more effective. They are effective and they are getting some things done. But I think there's more that they can do. And I think they're getting more funding from the Congress. They're getting more staffing. So I think with that, they can get more done for the election officials and the people of this nation.
Since you were involved so much in the creation of HAVA, and then you ended up creating the EAC, as you personally were working on legislation and things, did you have a point when you were like, that EAC portion of the law, that sounds like something I'd really like to get into? Or was it like, how did that happen?
I never had any intent ever. When I was looking at the legislation, I was looking at this commission, I really didn't think about going on that commission at the time. And you have to understand the context of the time. I was the executive vice president, COO of the International Foundation for Election System, a nonprofit foundation that was working to promote democracy and elections around the country. And I had 400 employees in 23 countries under my wing. I was really focused on that, but I became focused on the US. But it really came out of the blue when Roy Blunt called me to ask me if I would consider going on the EAC. I'd never really thought that, this was something that I wanted to do, only because I really liked what I was doing at the time. So I was honored when Roy called and asked me. But I have to tell you, I considered it for 2 weeks. It's not saying, oh yeah, I'm going to jump. Oh, this is great for me to do. I really had to, talk to my wife, pray about it, consider if this was something that I wanted to do. But in the end, I thought this was an opportunity for me to serve my country, but really to bring a voice to the election of election officials around the country, local election officials, to this body, because what it became clear to me from what Roy Blunt was telling me, that I would be the only one on the commission to have that voice. I felt this is something that I really needed to do, and so that's why I went forth and agreed to go on it.
So we try to find a good summarizing thing, but I think what I would really like to ask is, what advice do you have for up and coming local election authorities?
I think it's an important profession, and I mean, profession of election administration. And whether you run for office like you do, Brianna, or whether you're appointed to the job like Eric, like you are, and we have about 70% of the country where they run for these jobs, that you really have an interest in it. And this is hard when people run on a partisan basis, to take off the partisan glasses and look at it in a more bipartisan manner in serving all the voters of your area, of your jurisdiction, because that's really at its core what's important. And I think professional development is important too, that people have to understand this is an administrative job. You are a manager of elections in your jurisdiction, and details matter. I mean, the people out here who know me and hear that said, "Oh, well, that's Paul's mantra." That's what I've always heard Paul talk about. And that's what I would say to anybody wanting to get in this job and to get in and once you're in it, to understand the details, and I know plenty of folks who've gotten into the job in a partisan manner, who understand after they're in there, well, wow, I'm serving everybody, and I really have to tone down my partisanship. And I think if they do that, they'll find the job is very rewarding, that you're serving your voters. It's very difficult right now under these circumstances that people are attacking election officials for one thing or the other, and you have to have thick skin. But I think if you keep your honesty, your integrity, and your professionalism, you'll do a great job. And more than ever, we really need good people in these jobs.
Well, I guess maybe just to end on, Paul, when I was considering my current position, I think maybe very shortly after I had attained it, you and I were having lunch, and you were giving me a number of pieces of advice. And one piece of advice that you gave me that has always stuck with me, that didn't sink in right then, but you said, always do the right thing. And I just kind of felt like a platitude, like, of course, whatever, but after I'd been in the job for a number of months, then it sunk in, because like you said, there are pressures on you, external, internal. There will be people that ask inappropriate things of you and things like that. And that is a tough thing sometimes, to maintain the integrity and to always do the right thing. And I appreciate that piece of advice you gave me at the outset. And I didn't fully appreciate it at the time, but I do now.
Well, thank you, Eric. And mentoring you and is like Matt Masterson is one of the proudest things I've ever done in my life and in my career. So thank you for those kind words.
Thanks everybody for listening to another episode of High Turnout, Wide Margins, and a big thanks to Paul DeGregorio for being our guest today. We hope you liked it, and we hope you tune into the next episode of High Turnout, Wide Margins.